I want you to imagine a country sitting on one of the largest oil reserves on earth and yet running out of time. That country is Venezuela. And today, oil is no longer just oil. It is leverage, it is pressure, it is power. I'm Fareed Zakaria. And what we're witnessing is not a negotiation, it's a test of survival. The Trump administration has made its message blunt. Cut ties with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba, or lose the economic oxygen that keeps your state alive. 30 to 50 million barrels of oil, already extracted, already promised, but the money controlled by Washington. This is how modern geopolitics works. Not tanks first, but contracts. Not speeches, but supply chains. If you want to understand how power really moves in the 21st century, this story matters. Stay with me. Because before we can judge what's happening to Venezuela, we need to understand what's really being demanded and why now. What is happening here is larger than Venezuela. It is about how power is enforced when military invasion is costly and ideology has lost its pull. The Trump administration is not asking Caracas to reform overnight. It is asking for something far more specific and far more consequential. A clean break from America's adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. In return, Venezuela gets access to its own lifeline, oil production, oil sales, and eventually survival. But this is not a free market revival. Washington is demanding exclusivity, US companies, US buyers, US control of revenue. Even the money from oil already pulled from the ground would be held and distributed by the United States. This reframes the crisis entirely. Venezuela is no longer just a sanctioned state. It is a pressure point in a larger campaign to push rival powers out of the Western Hemisphere. And to understand why oil has become the chosen weapon, we have to go back to how Venezuela ended up here in the first place. For decades, Venezuela's story followed a familiar cycle: resource wealth, political centralization, dependency, decline. Oil did not just fund the state, it became the state. When prices were high, the system worked. When prices fell, the system cracked. Successive governments built an economy that exported crude and imported almost everything else. Institutions weakened, corruption deepened, and when sanctions arrived, there was no buffer left. Into that vacuum stepped new patrons. China provided loans, Russia offered energy partnerships, Iran shared sanction evasion tactics, Cuba embedded advisors deep inside the system. This was not ideology, it was survival. But that survival came at a cost. Sovereignty traded for dependence, oil traded for influence. By the time Nicolas Maduro fell, Venezuela was no longer just isolated, it was entangled. And now the clock is ticking, because when an economy can only last weeks without oil revenue, every demand becomes existential. The first rupture came quietly and then all at once. With Nicolas Maduro removed, the assumption in Caracas was simple: relief would follow. Sanctions would ease, oil would flow again. Instead, the opposite happened. The Trump administration moved fast. Oil sales were frozen unless new conditions were met. Foreign partners were named and targeted. And offshore, a massive US military buildup appeared not to invade, but to signal inevitability. This was the first real crisis for the interim government led by Delcy Rodriguez. Not a moral test, a mathematical one. Officials inside Washington believed Venezuela had weeks, not months. Without oil revenue, salaries collapse. Imports stop. The state fragments. And so the message was delivered: cooperate and survive, or resist and watch the system fail. If this feels like power without apology, that's because it is. And if you want to understand how modern pressure actually works, this moment matters. Pay attention, because beneath this crisis lies something deeper. A mechanism designed not just to extract oil, but to restructure allegiance itself. What we are seeing is not a traditional sanctions regime. It is something more precise, more surgical, The core mechanism is control without occupation. Washington is not trying to run Venezuela. It is trying to reroute its incentives. Oil is extracted, but revenue is intercepted. Sales happen, but proceeds are managed externally. U.S. companies are invited in not as partners, but as gatekeepers. This changes everything, because once the cash flow is no longer sovereign, power shifts quietly. Who gets paid? Who gets rebuilt? Who survives politically? The Trump administration has made its priorities explicit. First, expel foreign adversaries. Second, secure oil flows aligned with U.S. interest. Political reform comes later, if at all. This is realpolitik in its purest form. No grand speeches about democracy, just leverage, sequencing, and time pressure. And the pressure works because Venezuela has no margin left. When survival depends on a single export, whoever controls that export controls the future. But mechanisms like this never stay contained. They ripple outward. And that ripple produces the second, more dangerous crisis, one that moves beyond Caracas and into the lives of ordinary people. The second crisis doesn't announce itself with headlines. It unfolds on the ground. As negotiations drag on, uncertainty becomes paralysis. Oil workers wait, ports slow, contracts hang unsigned. For a country living week to week, delay is damage. Inside Venezuela, every unresolved demand creates friction. Foreign technicians begin to leave. Local networks tied to old patrons resist quietly. Drug gangs sense weakness and move faster than governments ever do. This is the hidden cost of leverage. Pressure concentrates power at the top, but instability spreads below. The interim government faces an impossible squeeze. Agree too quickly, and it looks like surrender. Resist too long, and the economy collapses anyway. And Washington knows this. That is why time itself has become the weapon. Not bullets, not bombs, deadlines. Because when a state is this fragile, even uncertainty can be fatal. And that brings us to the most important question of all. Not what this means for governments, but what it means for the person who has no seat at the table, for the person listening to this right now. Now, let me speak directly to you, because while governments negotiate barrels and alliances, you live with the consequences. If you are a teacher, your salary depends on oil moving again. If you are a parent, food prices depend on ports reopening. If you are young, your future depends on whether this country stabilizes or fractures. You didn't choose China or Russia or America. You didn't design sanctions or military pressure. And yet, every delay lands on your table. This is what geopolitical leverage feels like from below. Not ideology, not strategy, but waiting for electricity to stay on, waiting for medicine to arrive, waiting for the economy to breathe. And here is the uncomfortable truth. No external power is doing this for you. They are doing it for interests. So the real question becomes, who protects people when pressure is applied at this scale? If this matters to you, stay with me. Share this. Because understanding power is the first step to surviving it. And once you see how this affects individuals, you begin to see how the shockwaves travel far beyond one country's borders. What happens in Venezuela does not stay in Venezuela. When a major oil state is forced to realign, markets react first. Supply routes shift, prices recalibrate, and countries watching from the sidelines take notes. For Washington, this is about restoring a sphere of influence. For Beijing and Moscow, it is a warning shot. Energy partnerships are no longer commercial, they are conditional. If Venezuela is pushed out of the China, Russia, Iran orbit, others will ask a hard question. Who is next? This is how geopolitical pressure scales. One country becomes the example. Others adjust behavior before the pressure reaches them. In Latin America, governments recalibrate quietly. In Europe and Asia, energy planners reassess risk. Because if oil revenues can be intercepted here, they can be intercepted elsewhere. And this accelerates a larger trend, a world where access to resources depends not on markets, but alignment. That is the real global consequence. A system where neutrality shrinks and choices harden. And once the rules change at this level, the future stops being linear. It branches, which brings us to what comes next. The three paths Venezuela and the world around it may now face. There are three possible futures ahead, and none of them are abstract. The first is conditional recovery. Venezuela accepts the demands, foreign adversaries exit, US companies return, oil flows slowly at first, then faster. The economy stabilizes, but sovereignty is thinner than before. The country survives, but under supervision. The second is managed stagnation. Caracas complies partially. Negotiations drag on. Oil production resumes in fragments, enough to avoid collapse. Not enough to rebuild, the state limps forward, permanently fragile, permanently dependent. The third is systemic failure. Talks break down, pressure intensifies, oil remains locked, internal fractures widen. Criminal networks fill the gaps, the state cannot. And Venezuela becomes a cautionary tale of what happens when leverage outpaces resilience. These are not predictions, they are trajectories. And the lesson here is broader than Venezuela. In a world of weaponized interdependence, power no longer needs occupation. It only needs control points. And once you understand that, you begin to see why this story doesn't end here. This is not a story about oil. It never was. It is a story about how power is exercised when the rules have changed. When influence is measured not by territory, but by control over flows of money, energy, time. Venezuela sits at the center of this shift. A country rich enough to matter, weak enough to be pressured, connected enough to send shockwaves far beyond its borders. The Trump administration understands something fundamental in the modern world. You don't need to overthrow a government to reshape it. You just need to control what keeps it alive. And that should make all of us pause. Because if oil revenues can be intercepted here, if alliances can be dismantled through contracts, then the real battlefield of the 21st century is invisible. If you want to understand where the world is heading, pay attention to cases like this. Share this conversation. Stay curious, stay critical. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and this is the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. We'll continue this conversation in the next video.